anyway, clearly as a rhetorician working in the English department, I'm qualified to talk about trees, which is why I'm putting the humanist bit on there. I just want to situate this a little in terms of talking about where I'm coming from. When I have opportunities to talk to groups like this, I prefer to talk through something I'm still thinking through, rather than to present necessarily finished research, and that's something that I'm doing here. I'm trying to respond to something called the new material term in rhetoric, and I've been thinking about how to maybe respond to this for some time now, and this is a first crack at it. And I'm seeing some connections to the earlier talks already. I love your phrase, automatic storytellers. I don't know if that was off the cuff or
I don't even remember saying.
You said automatic storytellers. Yeah. And I really like thinking in that way. I'm interested in narrative and how narrative can lead and mislead us. So some of my earlier work has been about the intelligence community and how they can do good analysis, but if the wrong narratives are informing that analysis, then subsequent analysis is going to be corrupted by that. It's a very hard thing to see when you're in the narrative and when you're believing the narrative. So I'm going to start with a little background on rhetoric, my field, talk about this new material turn, and then we'll get into maps and soldiers and trees and the heart of the talk. But at any rate, my field of rhetoric is very odd and very old. Odd in that those of us who occupy it do not even agree on how to define it. One of my mentors, Jeffrey Walker, said that rhetoric is a 2,500-year argument over the definition of rhetoric. He also said more seriously that anything that leads to human speech is rhetoric. And so learning to speak, learning how to receive speech, how to interpret speech, how to make speech, these are all rhetoric. And so it has an inherent pedagogical angle in it as well. And I'll apologize if some of this is remedial for those of you in the room who may know about the split between rhetoric and philosophy, but I'm going to cover a little background here. And it's worth remembering that rhetoric and philosophy as modes of inquiry fell out with one another 2,500 years ago when that definitional problem started. Philosophers ever since have interpreted rhetoric as dismissive of and even hostile to truth and a pursuit of truth. There's something to analyze then in the fact that rhetoric has so often been depicted as female, even when it's depicted nobly. These are common and famous depictions of humanizations of rhetoric. Kicking off this rift, though, between rhetoric and philosophers were the sophists, a class of itinerant teachers of rhetoric who, in order to advertise their expertise, often engaged in a performance called dissoi-logoi, or contrasting arguments. Another way of interpreting this phrase is as making the weaker case the stronger. In these performances, the sophists would present an absurd argument, maybe even an offensive argument, and through the artfulness of their arguments, the craft of their language, they would entertain a crowd with twists of logic and unexpected interpretations of culturally powerful narratives. So the performance was to take an argument that was untenable and try and make it tenable and entertaining for the audience. And this was a way of showing their skill and dexterity as, didn't say that word very dexterously, as teachers of argument. Now, Plato was critical of the sophists and the practice of dissoi-logoi, and one of Plato's most famous and important critiques of sophistic rhetoric appears in his dialogue Phaedrus. Famously, Phaedrus is the only Platonic dialogue set outside the city walls of Athens and takes place along a clear, bubbling spring under the shade tree of a large plane tree, which is similar to what we would call a sycamore in North America. It has big, broad leaves. The plane is a significant species in Greek antiquity, featuring a number of myths, and widely at the time associated with wisdom, integrity, and chastity. Plato's Academy is said to have been planted in the plane tree for this reason, many of them around. In this particular dialogue, Phaedrus and Socrates undertake their spirited debate in the shade and shield of a plane tree. So symbolic, to be sure, given these qualities associated with it. Also can't help but make a connection here to the Bodhi tree from our previous presentation, right? So here is Buddha enlightened under the Bodhi tree. Here's a Western version of that narrative, right, where two interlocutors seek their form of enlightenment under a similar setting. But at any rate, early in the dialogue, Socrates remarks to his pupil, Phaedrus, "I am devoted to learning. Landscapes and trees have nothing to teach me. Only the people in the city can do that." Later in the dialogue, as the argument gains heat, Phaedrus swears an oath to the plane tree that they sit under, as one might make an oath to a god. a marked divergence from his teacher. It may be intended to show his irrational exuberance or something like that. In the dialogue, Phaedrus and Socrates argue over a piece of writing, and specifically a sophistic speech that Phaedrus has obtained a written copy of. At the time, writing was a new technology for the Greeks, and Plato can be considered an early adopter of the technology. It is a persistent issue for readers of the Platonic dialogues to have to wonder whether Socrates the character makes arguments that Socrates the historical figure would have made, or whether Plato is using the technology of writing to put Plato's own words into Socrates' mouth, or does Plato use Socrates as a foil, someone to make straw man arguments? At any rate, much of the Phaedrus is devoted to a critique of the new technology of writing, which Plato is writing down in the Phaedrus, right? Among those critiques is a fear that with writing to record and maintain our thoughts, human memory will atrophy, like an unused muscle, rendering us dependent. And this should be a really familiar fear, right? This really echoes fears that people express about current technologies. And here we have a few memory objects. So indeed, there are many parallels between Socrates' suspicion of the technology of writing and fears we have today about computing technology. So here we have an Incan quipu and an abacus and a cuneiform tablet for recording writing, and of course an iPhone. And so these two early computers are primitive versions of the same dilemma, right, that Plato is worrying about. At any rate, as Phaedrus and Socrates argue over dyssologoi, the nature of love, and the new technology of writing, they sit under the plane tree, and Greek readers would have been keyed in on one little additional joke. Famously, Plotinos, the Greek word for the plane tree, and Plato are derived from the same Greek word, platis, meaning broad. And so the plane tree in the text also may represent Plato himself, Socrates' former student lording over and overshadowing Socrates and Phaedrus. Did Phaedrus swear his oath to the plane tree, or did he swear it to Plato, a self-anointed through writing demigod of learning? The issues, though, raised in the Phaedrus ought to seem pretty familiar to us, for they were reinvigorated during the 20th century with what has been dubbed the linguistic turn, a development in epistemology and theory that deceiving speaker Angus Fletcher has addressed at length in his own work. If I can be permitted several gross and maybe polemical oversimplifications, I think of the linguistic turn as encompassing multiple disciplines and bodies of theory. It begins with modernism and logical positivism, schools of theory that ran through the humanities, philosophy, and the sciences. The basic premise of the linguistic turn includes an acknowledgement of semiotics and the disconnection between language and the objects we use language to describe. One might argue that modernism initially aimed to the sciences, seeking to establish humanistic inquiry as epistemologically similar to the scientific method. As the linguistic turn matured, it executed almost a 180, and postmodernism evolved, in which major theorists argued, essentially, that our world is made through language, with language actively constructing the realities within which we live. There are many more subtle theoretical positions contained within the 100 or so years of the linguistic turn, but this is the 20-second sketch. And I give you that sketch so that we can talk about the material turn in rhetorical studies. A variety of disciplines are now experiencing a material turn. It's called, in some of them, new materialism. And it's a notable shift beyond the semiotically defined world of the linguistic turn. My own field of rhetoric is heavily invested in the material turn. In a representative argument on behalf of this turn, rhetorician John Mucklebauer rejects the Aristotelian model of rhetoric that initially informed the linguistic turn and argues that, quote, the line of thought that follows from this break will lead to an image of rhetoric that does not require a formal setting, a legalistic orientation, an argument, language, or even the presence of an intending subject, end quote. If that claim is a little hard to follow, Mucklebauer provides an example of what he means, continuing later to say that, quote, the implicit, paradigmatic image of rhetorical studies today should be the event of heliotropism, or the movement of plants toward the sun. I recognize that this image will not be easily accepted, precisely because it seems to deal with the domain of nature rather than culture. In other words, there is nothing whatsoever human about a plant turning toward the sun, and that to me is its advantage, allowing for the possibility of flattening out the nature-culture distinction that is absolutely fundamental to the field of rhetorical studies. Now, the stakes in the material turn may or may not be high. We humanists are not going to stop paying attention to language, and the material world is one that humanists have too often neglected. But what does equating heliotropism with speech imply about human agency? Can we humans really consider the world from anything other than a human perspective? Mucklebauer and those who are making similar investigations have taken their cue from object-oriented ontology, a philosophical perspective that, as its name implies, derives at least in part from object-oriented computer programming. The impulse in rhetorical studies, the desire to create a so-called flat ontology, wherein the motion of a sunflower is considered to share certain qualities with Platonic dialogue, is what brings me to trees, living trees and dead trees. As I move through some very broad territory, in which we'll hear about soldiers, maps, trees, apples and avocados, home building and furniture making, I ask you to keep Mucklebauer's proposal in mind. Can we contemplate a world in which heliotropism and human speech are of a piece, whatever that piece may be? Are trees rhetoric? Do trees persuade? Do they persuade us, each other, or both? Do they generate narratives? Can philosophy and epistemology be modeled on a particular mode of computer programming? And here I'm going to shift into some other examples and tell a story that I think is almost certainly apocryphal. And the story precedes my time in the academy to when I was an intelligence analyst. And I'll tell you the story and I'll tell you why I think that it's apocryphal. So we made really fancy mapping products and we shipped these off to special forces groups around the world. And shortly after I began this work, I learned a story, not in a presentation like this one, it was the lore of the center where I worked. It was within our culture, this story. And the story was that we had built a really fancy map, and one of our analysts took it in theater to deliver it in Afghanistan in this case, as we often did. It was a fancy, like hardened laptop case, to protect it and all this stuff. And according to the story, the analyst presents this fancy product, shows all the things that it can do. And again, according to the story, one of the officers leading up the group takes out his sidearm, shoots the map on the map board, and says, "My map still works." Now, this is almost certainly apocryphal because nobody ever knew who the analyst was who witnessed this. And also because even in a combat zone, this would be a terribly cavalier thing for any officer to do. But probably what happened is an officer said something to the effect of, "If my map gets shot, it will still work," right? So even though this story is apocryphal, it was very important to our culture in terms of humbling us and trying to keep us from getting too enamored of technology and to remind us that this really old technology, paper, and a paper map, is really robust, right? So paper fails incrementally. It gets a little blurred, a corner gets torn off. With the digital map, it's almost a binary proposition, right? It works or it doesn't. And so this was, I think, intended to remind us about something humbling in our product and to remember where our product was going to be used and the things that it was going to be exposed to. And so this leads me to think about maps more generally, partly because I think that they're becoming antiquated as we have apps to do things for us. And so I'm thinking in particular about a really famous map series, the USGS 7.5-minute quadrangle map series, which is super cheap. They're super portable. People in dozens and dozens of fields use these in their field research. They're cheap to produce. They have great information. And they're made on dead trees, right? They're made on paper, if we just keep that material reality in mind. And the way that they, as somebody invested in the linguistic term, the way that they represent trees is pretty intuitive. So let's just use orchards and woodlands. Orchards, if you can see the projection, just like the pale green dots in rows, right? Like you would expect an orchard to be planted. And then woodlands are just like a solid shade of green, right? So pretty intuitive representation. What's not intuitive is the USGS definition of a woodland. A woodland is defined by the USGS as an area where at least 20% of an acre of territory is covered by vegetation 6 feet tall or higher, sufficient to conceal soldiers or fugitives. This, I think, is a weird way to define a woodland. But it makes sense given that the development of the USGS's 7.5-minute quads began in 1947 and continued throughout the Cold War. So they put this little tool in there for the military in case we were ever fighting a domestic war. And this is still built into the symbology of the maps. Now, inherently, maps interpolate. That is, they drop out and wash away information in order to focus us on more important information. And they do so by making certain estimations. You know, a life-size map of the world would be useless, even though it wouldn't have to interpolate. Cartographers use sophisticated computing software to interpolate as accurately as possible. Where once map makers guessed, now they calculate. But the most sophisticated calculations never can answer the question, why? Why are the trees here and not there? Why does the land slump that way over there? Neither the map nor the software used to generate it can compute cause and effect. And I turn here to one of Fletcher and his co-authors' articles to deploy their distinction between computational and narrative thinking. They define them, or say of them, I should say, this. The human brain can cogitate in more than logical rules, symbols, bytes, representations, and other computational methods and materials. It can cogitate in action. They continue. Action is composed of a cause and its effect. Action causally sequenced to another action or actions is narrative. So while paper maps can hold and convey enormous amounts of information, they don't tell us causal relationships between the data represented in the map. Digital wayfinding apps can hold even more data, as well as metadata, and can take on the computational task of finding us the most expedient route from point A to point B, but they too obscure causal relationships. We may be able to interpret cause and effect in a map, but that is human work, not the work of the map. Here's another example in maps. Geologists Scott Eaton and Chuck Bailey and their colleagues have changed our view of erosion. Once thought to be exclusively a slow, methodical process, they have shown that significant bouts of erosion take place suddenly during relatively rare and severe weather events, which they have dubbed mass wasting events. Mass wasting events, primarily through floods and landslides, cause more geologic change in a moment than thousands of years of less violent erosion from wind, water runoff, and chemical decomposition. Now, being experts in mass wasting, geologists could write and train an algorithm to process quadrangle maps to identify areas where mass wasting events are likely to have occurred, and maybe even where they might occur in the future. But the algorithm could not have made the discovery of mass wasting, which both required causal thinking and causal imagination. But it can be trained to detect signs of past events. Like a map, algorithmic computations also contain interpolation, and will have interpretation guesswork programmed into them. An algorithm executed by a microprocessor can identify any data points it is directed to detect, but it cannot identify things until it is trained to do so. In other words, we humans can outsource increasingly sophisticated computations to algorithms and computers, but the cognition of discovery is one of hunches, guessing, and observations of cause and effect. We humans can outsource computational tasks, but not narrative ones. Which brings me to apples. We are not the only organisms to outsource essential functions. In The Botany of Desire, Michael Pollan argues that some plant species, among them apple trees, have domesticated us. Commercial apple varieties reproduce only through grafting. Arguably, the apple, by occasionally producing particularly desirable fruits, has enticed us to carry out the taxing process of reproducing it. A tasty apple may not carry the genetics in its seed to reproduce itself, and instead we reproduce the apple tree. Unlike natural breeding processes, grafting reproduces 100% of a given tree's genetics. By outsourcing its reproduction to us, the Honeycrisp doesn't only reproduce, but becomes immortal, at least until we abandon it or are unable to carry out the work of grafting. Similarly, anachronistic species of trees are species that co-evolved into mutualistic relationships with companion species. The avocado most likely evolved its fruits to be eaten whole by now extinct giant ground sloths, which haven't been in Central America for 50,000 years. So the question is, how does the avocado adapt? 50,000 years is nothing in terms of evolutionary time. And so they haven't adapted, or have they? Perhaps like the apple, avocados have found in humans a new co-propagator. Instead of growing in the latrine spots of sloths, avocados may soon exist only in wheat orchards propagated by our species, little orderly dots on the quadrangle maps. So, like our apple and avocado overlords, have we humans begun to outsource evolutionary tasks, in our case not the task of reproduction, but the cognitive burdens of computational thinking? Rather than onto other earthly species, have we outsourced them onto devices of our own creation? First abacuses, now computers. If we increasingly outsource computation, we presumably free human attention for other things. What things exactly? More computation or more narrative? Dendrologists are able to study cross-sections of tree trunks and learn about our environmental past. They can see in the growth patterns years of drought, wet, and fire. Does such a record, produced independent of any humans, constitute a narrative? It is a record, to be sure, and contains within it signs of causality. But the ability to see in the signs, actions, and causality to link a burn scar in a tree trunk to a past fire, that small step seems to be particularly human. We find inside the tree trunk many readable signs. The tree and its interactions with the world, these material things, leave behind that record. But that initially imaginative recognition is the small jump from sign to meaning that separates computation from action and narrative. Nonetheless, it was narrative thinking, the ability to suspect connections between things like tree roots and subterranean fungal networks, that allowed Suzanne Simard and her colleagues to see that trees are connected through complex fungal networks, and that through these networks, trees share nutrients and even information. In her popular press book, Finding the Mother Tree, Simard relays the moment she realized that trees share resources and information. She describes being physically shaken and says, quote, "The sharing of energy and resources meant that the trees were working together like a system, an intelligent system, perceptive and responsive," end quote. Those are her words. She continues, "I had growing evidence that forests have intelligence, that they are perceptive and communicative," end quote. If trees might persuade us to undertake their reproductive work, might they persuade each other to share nutrients? Is heliotropism not as a metaphor, but a literal process, indeed a new model for rhetoric? I admit I'm still suspicious. Ian Bogost has been one of the leading voices of the still materializing material turn. In his book, Alien Phenomenology, he develops an idea that he calls carpentry. We have something else called carpentry. But carpentry, Bogost explains further, entails making things that explain how things make their world. Like scientific prototypes, the stuffs produced by carpentry are not mere accidents, waypoints on the way to something else. Instead, they are themselves earnest entries into philosophical discourse. This definition of carpentry that Bogost offers strikes me as a little similar to defining a woodland as a place where plants are tall enough to hide soldiers and fugitives. It's not that the definition is invalid, but that it hangs on a logic not useful to many except for a few specialists. There is, in both the USGS definition of woodlands and Bogost's definition of carpentry, a bit of misdirection, and bad puns are required at least once in an academic talk. They keep us from seeing the forest from the trees. Rather than insisting that philosophers ought to build things, we might instead see philosophy or rhetoric, arguments of priorities and values, in the things that non-philosophers build. The material turn encourages us to read things as we have traditionally read texts, and I think that is a timely and exigent call to analysis. The problem with Bogost's idea of carpentry is that we already have something called carpentry. It isn't a practice of building things as a philosophical practice, but a practice of building things for people to live in and sit on and admire. I would rather turn to the carpenters for philosophy than the philosophers for carpentry. Despite their claims to the contrary, the theorists of the material turn risk displacing humans from our thinking. If it is difficult for me as a rhetorician to accept that heliotropism is a form of rhetoric, then I wonder what our forestry experts think of it, especially in light of work such as Simard's. I suspect it is an even more suspicious claim to them than it is to me. And yet I can acknowledge that things, even natural things, contain in them rhetorical qualities. The apples and avocados invite us to cultivate. The spruce forests of Canada invite us to build, or do they? The decision of whether to turn a forest into homes or to preserve it as a park is a human one, even if the forest might make such invitations with equal force. What I'm getting at is that because we are human, we are incapable of contemplating the world any way other than through our own humanness. Does the tree invite us to do anything, or do we inflict meanings upon the tree? Without permission, I use another Fletcher and his co-authors' definitions to contrast one of their descriptions with Bogost's definition of carpentry. They write, quote, "In our day and age, when computation is the most well-articulated and pervasive analogy for reductionist models of human cognition, The claim that narrative is a mental act that cannot be computed may seem a prelude to invoking emergent properties, consciousness, or even the ineffable. But many mechanical problem-solving processes, sawing, hammering, wrenching, and screwing, are non-computational, and the same goes for narrative cognition's process of thinking from causes to effects. We see time and again, and now it's my words, not theirs. We see time and again that computational tasks can be outsourced, whereas narrative ones cannot. So to use the radiology example from earlier today, radiology can be outsourced perhaps. Maybe we can make that into a computational process, but we can't make building MRI machines into a computational process. We see this in our homes. If you live in a single-family detached home in the United States, you probably live in a platform frame home. That's the one on the right. Also called a stick-built home, these use standardized lumber sizes, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, to create the frame for the house, the load-bearing apparatus that loads everything up. Stick-built homes evolved in the United States in the late 19th century and replaced timber frame homes. That's what you see on the left. They're still built, but more as a luxury item than as a standard. The transition from timber frame building to stick frame building reduced building costs, sped the building process, might or might not have reduced lumber usage, and definitely reduced the skill necessary to build a building. In moving from timber framing to stick-built framing, we took the act of building the home from a primarily narrative activity and made it into a primarily computational activity. It seems we humans are doing this a lot, moving things from the realm of narrative thinking to the realm of computational thinking. This might be good if it frees us to pursue new or grander paths of narrative thinking. By breaking narrative tasks into computational processes, do we advance our species, or do we begin to separate ourselves from our own humanness? I'm grateful for MRI machines, but I drive very far to visit my primary care physician because he is the only one I have found so far who will allow me to sit for 45 minutes and tell him the story of my health. To pose the question similarly, but in perhaps less loaded manner, is the apple tree a genius for outsourcing its evolution and protection to humans? Or is it a decadence, some deep betrayal that undermines appleness and the processes that evolved the tree before humans took over? Clearly I'm being a little silly, but I'm also not. Stick-built homes have big implications not just for us, but for trees too. Relying on 2x4s, which can be cut from relatively small trees, trees no longer need to reach massive girths to meet our building needs. As 2x4s are standardized form, we can standardize the trees they come from too. Stick-built homes also allow us to utilize weaker, faster-growing trees than those required for timber framing. Driving across Georgia, known for both its forests and its forestry, you cannot help but notice how many pine trees are planted in rows, thousands and thousands of rows. They are not truly forests, but tree plantations, a monoculture. And here the ancient Greek concept of hyle is useful. Hyle refers to the inherent qualities of the material, which enable and foreclose certain possibilities. Hyle, according to rhetorician Aaron Flugfelder, quote, suggests that things are not the result of an autonomous human designer imposing his will upon inert materials, but the coordinating influence of human and non-humans together. For many Greeks, the common reference for hyle was to wood that has been or could be cut down and used in carpentry projects of some kind, be it for chairs, houses, or boats, end quote. In other words, materials have inherent qualities that determine their possible uses. These possibilities change as we learn more about those qualities. Trees were not available to the Greeks for papermaking, who had not imagined yet that wood could be pulped and repurposed, but we now have imagined and done such things. The thingness of the tree shifts. A new modality of hyle emerges. This brings me finally to one of the most successful examples to my mind of a human craftsman intuiting hyle and wielding his craft. I'm thinking of mid-century furniture builder George Nakashima. In his only book, The Soul of the Tree, Nakashima stated his philosophy of building plainly, quote, each part of each tree has its own particular destiny and its own special relationship to be fulfilled. We work with boards from these trees to fulfill their yearning for a second life, to release their richness and beauty. Of the objects that he built, he said, quote, these objects harmonize the rhythms of nature to fulfill the tree's destiny and ours. Each flitch, each board, each plank can have only one ideal use. The woodworker, applying 1,000 skills, must find that ideal use and then shape the wood to realize its true potential. The result is our ultimate object, plain and simple, end quote. Contrary to Socrates, Nakashima would have us learn from the trees. No wonder then that Nakashima's pride and joy was an enormous library of wood that he maintained, where trees were milled whole, cured and kilned, and then their boards restacked into the same positions they had occupied as unsawn trunks. Codexes of trees organized into a library of lumber, ready for use. And then this final slide is of one of the 3,000-year-old Japanese cedars that Nakashima traveled to sketch in his very last years, so I think it's a fitting place to end. I don't know if trees persuade each other or not. I don't think they persuade us, but that we find them very persuasive. It is a subtle but critical distinction. We see in trees values and possibilities, and both are influenced by the material realities and possibilities offered by the trees. For all his romanticism, Nakashima is really talking about the souls of people, not of trees. We need to be careful of and with the material term. It is a good thing for humanists such as myself to more thoroughly acknowledge and account for the realities of the material world and to connect those realities to things we have already discovered about language. But we misunderstand the tree and ourselves when we equate its movement toward the sun with our own speech. Of course, a little of my talk is actually about trees. I hope we will think about the narratives that drive our disciplines, whether they are true or apocryphal, and that we will think carefully about which narrative tasks we choose to break down and outsource to computation. Plato feared that writing would destroy human memory, and ultimately humans. It did not. The movement of cognitive work carried out by humans into computational work carried out by machines places us at a similar threshold. I hope we do not become too enamored of machines. Thanks. Any criticisms or questions or points of discussion?
I really did not like.
I
actually, did you know there's a Pan-American ground sloth in the science library here?
I think I did. I think my son and I have been able to see it.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just that made me think like you would definitely love to go see that.
Thanks so much. Any questions?
I mean, well, first of all, I thought that was totally mind-blowing. And what I love, I mean, the talk itself was a narrative because I kept thinking you were going to go in one direction and then something else. Anyone else had a similar response, I was like, oh, we're going, I was like, no. So, I mean, of course, you know, I mean, I agree with everything in the talk. I'm curious, you know, what would, if we are going to outsource a bunch of computational processes and other things to computers, right, and that could be a good thing. Right?
Which we do.
Right, they can connect things, they can connect where they can do those things. Yeah. And, you know, if you're right to say that, like, you know, we then don't have to turn the entire national into a version of ourselves where it's all doing, you know, narrative and persuasive and rhetoric and all the rest of those things. What do you think would be the value of just us doing narrative ourselves? Because, I mean, our schools don't do it. I mean, our schools really do train us largely in computation. Our businesses train us largely in computation. I mean, the weird thing is we have built a machine that can do this thing, and now we're trying to train ourselves to do it better than the machine, even though the machine can do it better than us. What can we do instead in school?
Well, so I think I'm exactly on the same page with you in the sense of, like, it's not worth much if we just do more computation, right? Because we can outsource that, right? And we can do computations with machines that we're completely incapable of doing as humans, right, with our own mind and a pencil and paper. So I think the answer is really simple. Just do more narrative. You know, I don't think we need to overthink it. And really my only answer is about volume, right? Like, and that's why I say do more narrative, because I agree with you also that, like, if you look at school, like, it really is about teaching, on the whole, maybe not 100%, but it's on the whole about teaching people how to compute in certain ways, and that's why students get to us and they're like, what do you mean, write an essay, like, what's the answer, right? And they get really frustrated because that's what we've taught them to do, right, is to seek out a correct answer. So I really think, and this is uncomfortable, I think in higher ed to say, like, just do a lot of volume of the thing, because that, you know, we believe in quality over quantity and this sort of stuff. Like, if that's our skill, then we need to do more of that. And I think that we need to recognize how important the role of narrative is in disciplines that don't see themselves as narrative. So it's easy for me as an English person to see myself as in a narrative discipline. I don't think that's necessarily true in all disciplines. And so if we can get disciplines to kind of engage with their narratives about what they are and the work that they do and get students to engage those narratives, maybe that will help with like Kimberly's project, right? And so it's a tough question because you're really asking about culture change. And I'm not sure how you do that. I don't see us doing it. I see us doing more and more computation.
So that's when I work in online learning, and one of the skills gaps that's identified between students needing higher ed and multiple different disciplines that they move into for work is that this is how can you tell a story with the data that you have, and somehow that's not being translated, right? It's like that computation just from the data or even the analysis isn't enough. It's like, what is the narrative behind it?
Well, and that's the value of disarray logoi, right? So you can exercise narrative, right? You can give people a bunch of weird elements and say, like trees and rhetoric, and say, you have to put these together, right? And that is valuable in terms of exercising that part of our brain where we have to think about connections between things, or contrive. I mean, that's what the sophists say, contrive connections between things. And so maybe that's how you train those skills, is put people actually in more synthetic situations where you're demanding that they create certain narratives that maybe don't immediately seem to have practical applications to artificial intelligence or whatever.
I have a question about the, oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I'm coming from engineering, and then we talked about computational thinking. I think that's all we do. And then in addition, we also do the design thinking part. But I think bringing the narrative and educating students to kind of think in that space is very valuable. I think like you're saying, and I can see some of the teams how they're relating those things to the materials, new materials, and things like that.
Yeah, and somebody like Nakashima would see design as narrative. I think he would want to sandwich those things together and not differentiate them necessarily. From
I think I'm also interested in not only the college level education, probably the STEM education, right? That's where probably, now they're winning the design and computation thinking, but they also know a little bit of narrative, so bringing all those three kind of thinking in that level is interesting. And then, I don't think and then lots of them, that's where they push to see
I agree.
how we can bring those aspects out. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I had is with the new materialists, are they denying that agency exists or that it's important?
I don't think I want to be really careful because it is a position I disagree with to not make a straw man of them. I don't think they deny agency. Well, it might be an implication of their work that agency gets denied. I don't think that is a premise of their work. I see that as a danger of their work, and I also see a danger in sort of like offloading human agency onto objects. And I see objects as really similar to how I see computation, in the sense of like, how do we relate to any object other than how, the fact that we're humans, right? So like, it's really, and I guess maybe I'm just stuck in the linguistic term in this sense, right? Because like, I can't relate to a tree except for all the ways that I think of the tree through language, and I think of its possibilities. And so like, this whole idea of a flat ontology, there's something that is very false about that to me, because trees and people aren't equal. And I might be being a little absurd to their position in saying that. But certainly, and I'm trying to, in using trees, I'm trying to give them an example that I think is in their favor, because it's from the natural world. Because if you give me a man-touched or man-made object, like that's just human rhetoric, right? Like a human designed that chair. So the object may have some agency, it may make me want to sit down. I see a chair and I realize I'm tired and I want to sit down. But a human designed it and built it and took the materials and made it. So like, really it's just an extension of human rhetoric, I would say. So my answer to them is always, it's just people all the way down.
So the other thing I wanted to just kind of like follow up on is two pieces that I think fit your worries nicely. One is by Dennett.
Okay.
I'm not using
spell
those
that?
efforts.
Okay.
D and then E. But Daniel Dennett, really famous. It's called Kinds of Minds.
Okay.
One of his minor pieces, but what he does is give a like how. So it's a fictional account of how minds could have evolved evolved. So how do you get minds like ours out of evolution, right? Seems weird. But, so he talks about like the first minds really just came with bodies, right? Anytime you have this awareness, you have like proto-minds. Then you have memory, right? If the thing you try doesn't kill you, you can remember whether it was helpful or not. Then you get the ability to kind of project. That's going to kill you. You get instinct, which is like pre-thinking. And he says kind of, he names these, but the thing that differentiates minds like ours fundamentally is tool use, of which language is the most prominent. But I think it makes a really good case for what part of what makes us human is the offloading.
Yeah.
Language offloads, thank you. So it's a really, I think it would be helpful and interesting. I don't think it makes you, you will not have to become a flat ontologist. And I think one of the things you can use to kind of keep from going there is by Bill McKibben, who's an environmentalist, and it's a book called Enough. And one of the arguments he makes, and having known Amish people, this makes me really nervous, but he says he refers to the Amish as the most technologically advanced people in the world. And that's because they don't flat out reject technology. What they do is consider how it affects their values and their life. And so, and you'll see this, I grew up in really rural Ohio. Some of them are allowed to have tractors, but they're not allowed to have pneumatic tires. Some of them are not allowed to have tractors. Some of them have cars, but they're prone. And that's the different churches making decisions about what does this add to the community and what does it take away from the community. And I think that's a really inaccurate view of the Amish. But I think that myth of the Amish is one we could potentially talk about.
Yeah.
Right? And this is again where I'm kind of going with my course, is getting students to think about how can we make these things.
Tool use and language are interesting because we're not the only things that use tools and use language. So like that is an acknowledgement of part of what the phytologists are arguing, right? So you know, for a while we thought it was tool use that made humans human, and then we thought it was language that made humans human, and now we realize that there are versions of this in non-humans, and
But I think this is right. There's a different, right? Because we also started off, we're like God, and everything else is not, right? And then it became kind of flat, but I think what we're going to see, the whole this it's people all the way down, but it's also, it's a range, right? We should probably take elephants really seriously. We should probably take cephalopods really seriously. Maybe should we take pork really seriously? Pigs, really seriously. Not vegetarian yet, right? But because they have minds more like ours in important ethical ways.
And the really important thing about your point is this is really about ethics. It's a certain point, right? Like who is in Pete Seeger's terms, who is in the circle of empathy and who is outside of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I think so like I think we can acknowledge this sense without having to take that materialist turn.
So I know that this was the very, 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 very abbreviated, rapid, overview. I'm wondering just to ask you, delve a little bit more deeply in the contrast between the linguistic term and the material term. Of course, the linguistic term itself, you were talking about materialist rejects, agency. Of course, the linguistic term famously rejected the author, the death of the author, the intentional fallacy and all of that. So I'm wondering, in the way that you situate yourself between those two, you describe yourself as sort of, being, part of that thing, still in that linguistic term. But are you perhaps asking to a third position, or how do you see?
I think I am, because I do see merit in the material world matters, right? And you look anywhere that people don't have things that they need, or are in cages or whatnot, and we ignore the material world at our own peril. So I do, Muckelbauer, who I think is a really good and thoughtful theorist of the material term, he has this, I didn't quote it, but I think this really important line in the same essay, where he says the conclusion that objects are rhetorical is completely uninteresting and not worth making. But the beginning point of analysis, that objects are rhetorical, is very interesting. And so if we see our material world as open to analysis in the same way that we've, regardless of your specific theoretical position, seen texts as rich and worthy of analysis, then we have something to contribute to the world. So that part of the material world, in terms of looking at everything as a text, that maybe actually was part of the linguistic turn also. But I think that's very worthwhile. Yeah, and incorporating various material realities into the way that we think. I think that's a contribution, and I don't want to push against that part of what they're saying.
So in doing that, are you imbuing those material entities with authority in some sense, or are you, or do you agree with the linguistics, turn rejection of the author in, what's the role of agency?
Yeah, I don't know about agency. Like I've thought about that, and I avoided it for very particular reasons in my language. But like, I like that idea of Heil here, right? Like materials have inherent qualities, and those qualities limit and make certain things possible, right? So you can do certain things with iron that you can't do with wood, and that's about their properties, right? And so I think for human, like this might be like duh to an engineer or a material scientist or something, right? But it's not something that humanists have given, I don't think, enough thought to, right? And so I think just considering the possibilities and constraints that different materials offer is a good starting point, perhaps.
Yeah, just one, I kind of really love the way you started with rhetoric versus philosophy, because I'm trying to think about ways in which why narrative can go wrong. And I know this is not the spirit of the conference, but no, but I think that there are a lot of it, when we're wailing about the world and statism, part of it comes from our penchant for narratives and to believe the narratives that we want to believe in. And so our richness in being able to use narratives as a tool is not, we have the instinct.
It's dangerous though.
It's, yeah, because you will be leaning towards things that fit with what you want,
Right.
or your own political beliefs, or your own backgrounds, or whatever it is. So I was interested in what you had to, I mean, you did point out one situation with what I'm going to talk about rhetoric in trees and force myself to create a narrative. I think that's cool. But what do you say to our...
What about when it's a conspiracy theory?
The problem with narratives per se can be used as like any tool, can be used this way or that way. And because it's so deeply set within us, our natural instinct is to go down the path of least resistance, or just to tell the story that makes the most sense, the most fitting in with our biases and everything, all the time, even though we think we're being open-minded.
Right.
So, as much as I completely believe in the power of narratives, I am not sure about what to do about this big problem,
Yeah.
which is that path of least resistance.
This is exactly the philosophical objection to rhetoric. It can be used for bad,
Yeah.
right? And you can seduce people with bad ideas. What's even more terrifying, I think, in what you're saying is not being seduced by someone else's narrative, but by our own bad narrative, right? And that's so much harder to kind of break. This is some of the research into like the QAnon stuff right now is showing that part of the reason that people get sucked into that world is because it's designed almost like a video game. And so people construct the narrative themselves. And there are these kind of Easter eggs. And so because they think they've come to the conclusion themselves, it is really hard to shake them out of that narrative commitment that they now have because it's their own, right? And so I don't know what to say other than yes, that is the danger. But maybe volume helps here as well, right? Like if we, especially I keep going back to this word synthetic. If we synthetically play with narrative a lot, then maybe that shows us how open to manipulation it is, just like all sorts of materials are open to manipulation. And so maybe that will destabilize kind of like this, every time we have a narrative feeling, instead of being really confident in it, maybe we realize that like they're constructed, just like lots of other things. Maybe that would help. I'm not sure.
And also to your other point, I mean, the problem with narrative is it's not about truth. And that's always the problem, is that when people think narratives are true, they always get into trouble, you know? And the value of narrative has always been, it provides possibilities. And really the value of a volume approach to narrative is you could construct a school where there were lots of narratives, and that would provide lots of possibilities. And the way that we get caught is when we live in a society that's constantly recycling one or two narratives over and over and over again and depriving us of possibility.
This is implicitly why a lot of people think diversity is good in education, right? Because you get exposed to narratives that are not prevalent. And so it's it's not inherently just that you're sitting next to someone who's different than you, but in interacting with them, you are going to hear and see different perspectives on the world, and that's going to sophisticate or complicate or whatever your own narratives about the world. So like, I think we forget like, getting the person in the room is not enough, right? Like then the narrative work has to take place as well.
Yeah, it's like piecing some of what everyone's been talking about. I love the idea of contriving situations in which people would be surprised by many different stories, like even building, projects in schools, kind of framing around that. I used to joke about how I have twins, they're 4.5, and I'm like, when they get a little older, I want to like set up pranks for them every day after school so they come home like, what am I going to expect when I get home? Because it's like that is almost the point of computational tools creating data to show us something interesting about our world, because otherwise who cares? Like you already know it.
Yeah.
So it seems like the space where you can blend like that tool with this other tool. Actually, one tool is one we made and one tool is one we're born with.
Yeah, you made me think of something I had thought of since I was like in 3rd grade, which is in my elementary school they had this thing, I don't know if it still exists or not, but they call it Odyssey of the Mind. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if it works the same way, they just give you a bunch of weird stuff.
Yeah.
And then they
It's
give you a
very similar,
problem,
yeah.
and they'd be like, use your stuff to find a solution to
Yes,
the problem.
yes.
And I envision something similar with narrative, right?
Yes.
Like, here's your dilemma. Here's, you have to talk about a race car, a fig, and that
Yeah.
elephant, and solve the problem, right? So like a similarly sort of disconnected box of things that you have to incorporate.
Right, like we don't practice surrealist games hardly enough at all.
It's a tough sell.
Yeah, it's a tough sell, even though it's like the best time you'll ever have, so.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, so. One here.
Okay.
Zach, go
You
first.
want to go for? Okay. I don't know if I'll be able to verbalize this well. It's just like a lot of going on. But like one thing I feel like something that keeps being hit on is that like narratives they open up possibilities. Like the this term I think it's destabilizing methods. I believe it's talked about by this professor at University of Toronto called Dr. Vervaeke. First used by, he says it was originally used by shamans like 40,000 years ago to kind of disrupt the way that they interpreted patterns, and so to kind of basically forge new paths and achieve greater understanding. But one thing I'm curious about, Dr. Fletcher, in your mention of, or I guess both of you guys, your mention of narratives not necessarily opening one's eyes to truth, but more to new possibilities. Where is the difference then? How does this not turn to a postmodern thing? Does that make sense?
Guilty? I don't know, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure it matters, right? Because in the sense of like there is stuff from the new materialism that I think is really valuable, and there's stuff from the linguistic term that's really valuable, even though we're really talking about 20 different types of theory when we say the linguistic term, right? And so maybe it only comes back to intentionality and care and an awareness of ethics in the things that we're doing. Because I think part of the reason that it's a tough sell, play with narrative and whatnot, is because it sounds so relativistic to so many people, right? People who have really strong narratives about the world and how it works, regardless, I'm not talking about right or left, regardless of where those narratives come from, it's very destabilizing to talk about things that are going to potentially bring those into question. So so it looks like relativism, and it looks like it's unmoored from ethics. And I would argue the opposite, like this is a way to engage ethics. Like this is a way to remind ourselves that our narratives have ethical components regardless, right? That's why sometimes a apocryphal narrative can be a good narrative if it's not true, but it teaches us the right lesson, right? And so, I don't know, the thing I was thinking of when you were bringing that up was like all the experiments, and I don't know if it's good science or bad science or not, but with psychedelics, and how people are really experimenting with psychedelics now as a way of like disrupting narrative patterns in like people who have PTSD and these sorts of things. And so I do think that there's this kind of convergence of like humanists like me and really experimental scientists who are asking, I think, actually really similar questions, but we don't ask them together very often. So I think your question points to the importance of like the thing you're asking. I think it's an important question.
One last question?
Thanks so much. So this, I think relevant to this question of narrative and ethics, it's more of a pedagogical question. So I also work in the English department, and I kind of see in the classroom and just sort of in my studies in general, there's a kind of reluctance, I think, to sort of play devil's advocate, and it's almost become a meme now, of like, oh, they're just playing devil's advocate. I think there is this kind of reluctance to sort of play with narratives, or sort of, because the stakes feel so high. And I don't know if you have seen something yourself, or like if you had any kind of, I don't know, advice on like ways to encourage a sort of ethical playing with narrative in the classroom where people feel able to do so, and they're not being like, I don't know, disloyal to what they think. Do you know what I mean?
I think your kind of anecdotal sense that students are uncomfortable with this sort of play is really spot on, right? Because they're either afraid of offending their classmates, or they're afraid of somehow betraying the things they believe or where they come from or something. But I think it goes back to that word synthetic. So like, there's of course value in talking about like the things that are happening in our culture, and I'm not saying that there's not. But like, in order to play with narrative, maybe what you need is a non-threatening situation, or like, so like a made-up situation that's not explicitly connected to things happening right now. In the classical tradition, this is why, for hundreds of years, people were trained in Europe using examples from Rome and Greece, because it was seen as like a politics of not our own. So we can argue over this, but we're not arguing about what's happening right now, and we can argue for the sake of arguing. So it's seen as safe, right? So maybe what we create is non-current or more abstract spaces to experiment with this stuff, because I think that's a very real issue right now. But I'm not saying don't talk about things that matter. Just for the purposes of that.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was fantastic.